If you're a good startup CFO, you do have your cash flow statements in order. You know what cash is necessary to build your business. If you know that, you can start defining your capital requirements. And actually, every entrepreneur starts basically the same way, with his own money or with family and friends' money, with your grandma and grandma, can you give me $1,000 or $1,500? And the company is running okay, maybe grandma's gonna give you more and more, she's gonna get angry. Well, this is what entrepreneurs do, and actually this is also what entrepreneurs do in larger scale. If you look at all the examples of very successful companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, they had so-called financing rounds, and not like these financing rounds, very small financing rounds. They had to go into what you can see over here, larger rounds, because family and friends' money is not an infinite source. And this means you have to look for more professional sources. Every entrepreneur probably starts with his own money, and we're gonna talk about that. However, if you look into a study, and this study is taken from the Timmons book on new venture creation on 70, 60 entrepreneurial companies, on average, those companies had losses for the first 30 months, and then they went on a monthly break even, and the equity break even was after 75 months. So, meaning that these companies actually lost money in the first 30 months. They had to finance the first 30 months, and maybe even more if they needed some working capital. So financing for all those companies is needed, and if you go into the Silicon Valley or even into other valleys, like if you go to Berlin, everyone is talking about his business, making the business big. But is this really necessary? I don't want to question the study in general, but I want to question that every entrepreneur needs a lot of money from day one. And look at some of the very successful stories. One of the German successful stories is SAP. And SAP is a company founded in the 70s in Germany by 5 former IBM employees. And they wanted to build standard application software for data processing, actually starting with mid-sized companies. And how did these guys finance their business? What were their financing sources? Well, first of all, we have to take into account that in the 70s, there was no venture capital in Germany. Actually, there was little venture capital. There were business angels around. Business angels are in Germany for more than 100 years. But not really institutionalized as we can see it by today. And actually, you can ask the question, how was it possible to build such a well-known large company with many, many employees nowadays without getting financing? Actually, this is for every software company, you can have the same thinking. You can ask the question, do you program your software for the first, let's say, 3 years with your software programmers, and then sell it to the public or to the companies you want to sell it to? So then you have to finance the first 3 years. Remember the gap between cash outflows and cash inflows. Or do you want to develop your company in a different way? Not doing the R&D first and then selling, but maybe you can develop the software together with one of the first customers you have. This is actually the example of SAP. Those former IBM employees, they sold the computers to those mid-sized companies who needed the software. Actually, this is why they came up with the idea. So they went to those companies and said, we are software consultants. We can program the software for you. You're going to pay us for that. So that was software consultancy. And later on, we can take the source code and sell it to others. Which means the first business model is a non-scalable model, a consultant model, And then you switch it into a scalable model which made SAP so successful. And you can still do it by today. The same way of thinking. So, okay, do I program my software first for the first 3 years and then sell it? Or do I take the first customers, sell myself as a software consultant, and afterwards I scale up by selling the source code to others? What's the financial implication? In the first case, program selling, you need to finance the 3 years. In the second case, you don't need any financing. That's what SAP did. And this is just one example of two companies. Actually, when I started my first company selling out-of-print books online, we had a competitor in Germany who did the same business without financing. The big difference between those companies were the growth rates, for sure. Our company was growing to a large extent. Actually, we were able to cover Europe then and merge it with a Canadian company, sell it to Amazon. That was this story. Our competitor didn't grow too much, but they survived. And that's important. And there was the day, actually, when we were very close to bankruptcy because we needed additional financing, and it was hard to get, especially in the new economy crisis. So it could have happened that we were going bankrupt, and the other company who was developed and taking a slow path of development survived. You see, the same business, the same idea, two ways to execute the business. More stories to that. Zalando is a growth-related company. They're doing the same as Zalora in the US, so selling shoes, fashion, and all sorts of things. Online, they actually take every euro they earn and invest it back into growth. Google, more ideally related. Actually, these guys never wanted to found a business in the first instance. When Andy Bechtolzheim came over and gave them some money in order to found the business, a different strategy. So what I'm saying is we have different potential strategies to execute your business, and this largely influences financing. That's the first thing to think about. And this is why I said strategy is very closely related to financing. And there's an interdependency, because if you can't obtain financing, you have to change your strategy, for sure. The second thing, we were talking about financing rounds. So what is this, a financing round? Actually, it's the question, and you can also see it, Zalando, Google, Facebook, all these companies did many financing rounds, which you might ask yourself as a startup CFO, is it really necessary? Because it's a lot of work. Isn't it possible to just take 10 million and build a large company? No, I have to have 100,000 from Andy or 400,000 from Peter Thiel, and those small amounts getting bigger over time. Well, this is what economics is about, and there's one equilibrium, which is the risk-return equilibrium, the trade-off between capital and cost, and this is always true. And even in this setting, and the general setting is reflected in interest rates. What is an interest rate? An interest rate has a risk-free component, which is buying something today is just nicer than buying it tomorrow, so I have to pay for this time difference. And the second is the so-called risk premium. Where can you see the risk premium in the interest rates? Actually, if you look at bonds from various countries. So bonds from Germany or the US have a lower risk premium than bonds from Brazil or other countries. Why? Because there's higher bankruptcy risk for those bonds compared to German or US bonds. Means you basically pay for the bankruptcy risk with the risk premium. If you, as Brazil, want to obtain debt capital, you have to pay more than if the German finance minister wants to obtain debt capital. This is the risk premium. And this is also the risk-return relationship. That is always true in basically in most cases. What's in entrepreneurial finance? Actually, same thing. If you start your business, you're facing high uncertainties. If you face high uncertainties, investors ask for high returns, meaning they give you a low valuation of your company. If you can show proof with your company, valuation is going up. Means you can obtain more money, you can get more capital for lower cost. This is basically also true in an entrepreneurial finance setting. And that has implications for defining your financing rounds in your startup setting. Because startups normally do it in an ideal way like this, what you can see on the slides. They define the business strategy first. We had the SAP example, with the software programming example, with our example of our startup, my first startup, and we had the example of Zalando versus Google and so on. So they follow a business strategy. You need capital, you need more capital, you need less capital. This is the total amount of capital you need. And then you try to understand out of your business strategy, when do I reduce my perceived risk for the investor? So when does the investor think, oh yes, this might be a business that works out. So a first prototype might reduce the risk. The first customer might reduce market risk. 5% market share might reduce market risk even more. Or in the medicine technology sector, if you are successful in your preclinical studies, you reduce the risk. If you're successful in the clinical studies, you reduce the risk. If you get FDA or CE certification, you reduce the risk. So these are typical milestones that reduce the risk of your business. And what does it mean, reducing the risk? Actually, we have to talk about uncertainty normally in the setting, but I'm using a general language here. So what does it mean, reducing the risk? Reducing the risk is capital gets cheaper because your valuation goes up. So you get the same amount of capital for less shares. This is what it means. So what you do as a startup CFO, you look for the first seed financing and you try to get as much capital in order to achieve the first milestone plus to realize the first financing round. This is the amount of time you need to have capital for. And then you do the same thing. The next financing round, you'd like to achieve the next milestone, to reduce the risk, and with this reduced risk, higher valuation, you get back to the investor and say, okay, I want to get more money. Next and next and next. And this is basically how valuations go up, because risk is going down and you can get more and more money into your company for less cost. To be honest, this is also to some extent an ideal path. In theory, that's totally true. In practice, it's sometimes difficult. Where are the difficulties coming from? Actually, you might need more money, so you run out of your plan. Customers don't come, you even run more out of your plans. And maybe those capitalists change their minds and say, I won't give you money for that kind of business. Remember, the internet bubble bursted in 2000. Nobody wanted to finance internet anymore. Remember the financial crisis. Nobody wanted to do money into this asset class. So in practice, many things can happen that will destroy that theoretical picture. However, theoretically, this is the way to approach financing and financing rounds for a startup CFO. Understanding the business strategy together with the CEO, trying to understand the main milestones. The milestones are the one who reduce the perceived risk for the investor, and then adjusting the financing round.